So our guest today, her name is Devi Ward Erickson. She is the founder of the Institute of Authentic Tantra Education, which is the first and only government-accredited professional training institute using the Tibetan Five Element Tantric process for holistic sexual healing. She is a ACS certified sexologist, certified tantric healer, certified Reiki practitioner, certified meditation instructor, and has been teaching meditation and personal growth workshops for over 20 years. She is an author, and as I said, she's the host of the Sex is Medicine podcast with Devi Ward Erickson. I want everybody to put your hands together. I want, and not just a regular round of applause. I want you all to get up out of your seats, and I want y'all to put your hands together and just give it all you got for our great guest, Miss Devi Ward Erickson. Now, come on, give it up. I want all my crowd. There you go. Thank you.
Yay!
How you doing,
Thank you so much for. I'm doing so well. Thank you so much for having me. That was a wonderful, wonderful welcome.
No problem. I try to improve my welcome me. I just love doing it. But once again, you are one of the guests that I circled your name. It was on like my when you put those lists together, like I have to have this guest on my podcast. So I'm just so excited to have you. So once again, thank you.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor.
Yes, ma'am. So for those who don't know about you, and could you give some background information about yourself and kind of what led you to becoming a certified sexologist? Like how did you get into all of this information?
Yeah, well, it was a big surprise for me and completely unplanned. So,
okay.
Little background. So my family is from Detroit. I was born in Washington D.C., but my mom and my dad were both from Detroit. And so when I was a teenager, I was and in college, I was living in Detroit, and I was a stripper. I was a stripper in Detroit. And that was my kind of my introduction to the sensual arts. And then after that, I had a long history of trauma. I had sexual abuse trauma and physical abuse trauma, and grew up in a home of domestic violence and just all kinds of suffering that I experienced. I had luckily a failed suicide attempt at the age of 19. So it was pretty messed up, and I was really, really in pain, and I was looking for peace. I was looking for healing. And so I ended up becoming a monk in a spiritual organization called the Ashaya's Ascension, and devoted the next decade of my life to practicing and teaching the Ashaya's Ascension meditation. So that took me until about the age of 32, 33, when I made my way to Kauai, Hawaii. And I was given the opportunity to train in this traditional Tibetan 5-element sexual healing practices. And because I had committed my life to spiritual healing, I was very interested in learning how to incorporate sexuality into that process. This was entirely new territory for me. Up until that time, I had done all the new age healing things. I had, done raw foods. I had done fasting. I did crystal healing. I was certified in Reiki, like all the woo-woo things that are out on the market now. But the one thing that I hadn't learned anything about or had any, education or training around was sexuality, and specifically how to utilize your sexual energy for spiritual realization and for spiritual growth. So when the opportunity presented itself to me to train in these lineage-based methods for sexual healing, I agreed to go through a 6-month period of intensive training. And so when I was, I think it was like May of 2008, I began my training in the Tibetan 5-element sexual tantras. And the healing that occurred from these, within the first few weeks, the healing that occurred from using these methods was so revolutionary. It was so profound. I mean, there really aren't words to describe. The healing wasn't just about my sexuality. The healing was about my mind. The healing was about confronting all of the trauma that I was trying to disassociate from my entire life, and that I hadn't processed, and that I hadn't recognized, and that I hadn't dealt with. And this gave me tools to be present with it, to heal it, to process it, and finally to release it fully. Okay. And I very quickly changed traditions and became a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and began training in non-sexual Tibetan Buddhist practices under the guidance of my teacher, whose name is Lama Tashi Dundrup. And after several years of working with both the sexual and non-sexual methods under Lama Tashi's guidance, he gave me permission to share these methods with other people, to go out and teach on my own. And that was very, again, it was very consequential, because these Tibetan healing methods used specifically with sexuality have never been taught in the West before. They are ancient teachings that are several thousand years old that literally have never been taught openly in the West. And so he gave me and our school permission to share them openly. So it was through this process that I became a certified sexologist as well, because these are, the field is our orientation is sexual healing, and teaching people, educating people about how our sexual energy and our sexual pleasure is literally medicine for the body, mind, and spirit. And through this process, there's a professional organization called the American College of Sexologists International that saw my work and really valued it, and they offered credentials to me and all of the graduates from our training program.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. And I think one of the greatest parts about it is your education in it, because I'm learning more about the spiritual aspect of sex, or the holistic aspect of sex. I always looked at sex from a perversion aspect, because that's how I was taught about sex until I started studying it on my own. And when I started studying it on my own, I used to say that there's a science to sex. And as I've learned more, I now understand and say that there is a wholeness, there's a spiritual aspect to sex. And I'm in Florida, so we're in the deep South, we're in the Bible Belt. So in this area, you have sex, and you have a lot of sex, but you don't talk about it, and you don't learn anything about it. And that's why I'm so grateful for you being here today, because we get to expand our perception of sex, rather than just what is taught or through a pornographic lens or something like that.
Yes, exactly. Very true. And that's the beauty of these Eastern traditions, is several thousand years ago, and again, they are several thousand years old, but they're still very relevant today. And they knew and understood that sexual pleasure is healthy. It's an appetite. In the Taoist tradition that comes from ancient China, they often talk about our sexual libido and our sexual desire like your appetite for food. And so just like when we get hungry, we don't get mad at ourselves or feel shame or guilt because we're hungry and we need to eat food. We understand what's normal. You have to eat food in order to survive. Well, that's the way they viewed sexuality and sexual pleasure and sexual appetite. It's a normal, healthy appetite. And so these societies didn't have all this shame and all this toxicity and all of this dysfunction in regards to sexuality, because they viewed it as a natural, healthy expression of what it is to be a healthy human being.
Right. Yeah, and that makes sense. That definitely makes sense, rather than coming from a culture of seeing sex as shameful, even though people are having sex, but it's still seen as shameful. Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes it more of a healthy exchange when you're doing it.
Well, yeah, and shame is a trauma, right? So if you think about in this culture, like our society teaches us to feel shame and embarrassment and guilt about something that's totally natural and totally normal. And that actually creates emotional and psychological trauma and wounding. So what we see in our culture in regards to sexuality is actually an expression of trauma. Our society is a very dysfunctional relationship to sexuality. It isn't healthy. So that's why you see these things like extreme pornography, which I want to say that, like, I have friends who are sex workers and friends who are in the porn industry, and it can absolutely, pornography can be done in a way that's healthy and enriching and supportive. But when you combine porn with shame and guilt, you're creating a really, like, a toxic soup. And that's why you see so much dysfunction and so much addiction around pornography, is that people don't have healthy resources available to cultivate a more, as you said, holistic, a more wholesome, a more integrated experience of their sexuality.
Yes, ma'am. I definitely understand that. So let's kind of, I want to start from the beginning. So what, and from your training, from your experiences, what is sex? Like, what's the purpose of sex, and how can sex be beneficial?
Yeah, that is such a great question. So in my training in the Tibetan Tantric tradition, everything is very multifaceted, right? So on the most base physical level, we understand that sex is for procreation. We create other human beings, and that's, to me, that's a miracle. Like, it is an absolute miracle that two human beings come together, ideally in love, and we know it doesn't always happen that way, but ideally in love, and you literally create another human being. I mean, that truly is a miracle. It really is. But we also know that every time we make love, we're not creating babies. So where does all that energy go? So from the tantric perspective, sexual energy and sexual pleasure is vital life force energy that we can cultivate and we can use to heal and enrich our energy body, to heal and enrich our physical body, and to cultivate vitality in every area of our lives. It is literally life force. It's literally life force energy. And if we can use mindfulness and presence, and that's, really what these tantric teachings are all about, to consciously cultivate this energy in a way that's enriching and delicious and wholesome and healthy, it will literally heal our bodies. It will heal our energy body, which if you do yoga, you'll be familiar with the energy body, and it actually can heal. It can actually heal and release trauma, repair our nervous system, and repair traumatized neural pathways in the brain. So we really, truly embrace the concept that sexual pleasure is, in fact, medicine, and it is our birthright to understand and know how to cultivate it and use it accordingly.
Wow. Okay. Now, yes, that definitely makes sense. And it makes sense for me personally because a lot of the studying that I've done and learning about the life force that sex can bring or can help enhance, and how a lot of the practices that we learn here in the West, as far as like semen retention, for example, that's something new that I'm learning. So when you said the life force, that's one of the things that I thought about is we're taught to continuously spill our semen as men, just continuously spill, whereas in the East, it's talk about semen retention and preserving your life force, and as you spoke about, transforming your life force. And it's just the differences in the mind states really stands out. But from your experience, coming up in Eastern cultures, do you see a lesser occurrence of sexual trauma in these aspects or within these cultures, with all of the differences in the teachings, with a teaching of healing versus a teaching of trauma? Within the teachings of healing, do you see less occurrences of sexual trauma?
Well, yes, but keeping in mind, again, that these teachings are several thousand years old. So you have to account for, the patriarchy, right? So for the last couple thousand years old and more, it's been a very, male-dominated society. And included in that, there's been a lot of suppression of healthy sexuality. And this has been going on for centuries, if not thousands of years. And so in the Eastern traditions today, they're actually very shut down. Like if you look at China is a communist country, and they're completely repressed sexually. The Tibetan tradition has been held mostly by monks, and they have aversion to women. I mean, they treated women terribly. They're very, very misogynistic. In India, the Indian culture is very patriarchal, very misogynistic today. So what we're drawing upon, again, are teachings that are several thousand years old that have been passed down through scripture and that sort of thing. And so in that context, yes, there's a lot less sexual trauma. But I would have to say today, I would say that sexual trauma is one of the most prevalent forms of trauma on this entire planet. And it is a result of the patriarchy. It is a result of disconnecting and disassociating from our humanity.
All right, that makes sense. Okay, that definitely makes sense. All right, so my next question comes from my experience as a HIV/AIDS counselor, tester, educator. For the past 10 years, I've taught HIV, STD prevention, and within that, we've learned that we have to talk about sexual education. We have to learn more about sexual education. We have to learn more about sex. And the aspect of having good sex, the aspect of having pleasurable sex, because when I'm thinking about, when I say sexual trauma, I don't mean it in the traditional sense, but more so if a guy is trying to penetrate a woman and she's not lubricated enough to receive, he could cause some kind of trauma there trying to penetrate her. And I understand arousal has a lot to do that. I understand connection has a lot to do that. So during sexual education, do you think it's important to not just teach about basic sex, like this is sex, birds, well, not even the birds and bees, throw that out, but real sexual education, but not just how to have sex, but how to have good sex as well? Do you think both of those aspects should be taught?
Absolutely. I mean, as you've been saying, I mean, you've obviously been doing your homework. That's apparent in everything that you're saying. So yeah, and so that in the field of sexology is referred to as pleasure-based sex education. So sex education isn't just, the sperm leaves the penis and goes to the egg, and then you have the cells divide and all of that, and here's how to prevent diseases and illnesses, and okay, go have fun, right? Or don't have fun. The message that we get in mainstream sex education is here's how it happens, but don't do it. Right? Essentially, don't do it until you're married, and then all of a sudden when you're married, you're supposed to know how everything works. And then, but you're not supposed to talk about it with your partner. Your partner's just supposed to show up in bed, magically knowing exactly what to do and how to do it. Yeah. And nobody's ever taught anybody. So we're literally bumbling around in the dark, totally confused, and not talking about it because we're too embarrassed and ashamed. So absolutely, could you imagine if when you were a little child? So here's one of the things I teach often is that sexual shame is learned behavior. So for all of our listeners right now, if you feel shame or embarrassment about your sexuality, it's because somebody taught you that. That is not inherent. We are not born with sexual shame. It is learned behavior. So imagine if when you were a little child, you learned from your parents that sex is healthy and pleasure is healthy and that you do it with people that you love and respect. Right, and that mommy and daddy, or mommy and boyfriend, or daddy and girlfriend, however it works out in your family dynamic, are demonstrating healthy intimacy on a regular basis. And then imagine in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, instead of just learning, this is how babies are made and, here's how to not get pregnant, we learned about, so sexuality and sexual pleasure and sexual desire is healthy. And it's also really important that whoever you're engaging with, you do it in a way that's consensual and respectful and that you're communicating. Oh, and by the way, self-pleasuring is really healthy too. And here's some different ways that you can pleasure yourself. And then when you learn how to pleasure yourself, then you feel more comfortable sharing that with a partner when you get to the point when you have a partner. Oh, and here, you know, and because we're being mindful about sex, we want to make sure that we don't have babies before we're ready. So here's some things that we can do to make sure that we have choice around when we reproduce. And for the rest of the time, we just get to have this really beautiful, pleasurable experience that's healthy for our brains and healthy for our bodies. Imagine what the world would be like if that was the kind of messaging we received around sexuality from the time we were little.